Well, if there ever were an iconic year for Cadillac, it would have to be 1959, where the supreme development of the fin clearly took over at Cadillac. As one of its designers, Dave Holz, who would later go on to become chief designer for Buick, as well as Chevrolet and even GM's Opel Studios, would pen a car with fins so large it would make buyers forget about the 1957 Chrysler products that had been introduced with very large fins. Of course, Cadillac was not to be outdone by Chrysler, and thus the 1959 Cadillac with its extremely tall fins was born. Now, the 59 Cadillac, while it's certainly iconic, particularly from the rear view, is a interesting car. It's not necessarily all that beautiful, even in the eyes of its designer, Dave Holz, who never really quite came to grips with the fact that he designed this iconic car of the late 1950s. And so for 1960, Cadillac thought that it would go in a different direction and tone down a number of elements of the 1959 model and make them more restrained. Now, a harbinger for the 1960 models was the 1959 Eldorado Brougham. And yes, I said Eldorado Brougham. Many of you are familiar with the 1957 to 58 Eldorado Brougham, an extremely expensive, custom-made Cadillac that had so many different features that were unique for its time, even memory power seats. And it came with shot glasses as well as a shaker. Now, while that 1957 to 58 Brougham is well known but rare, many people don't even know that Cadillac produced another Eldorado Brougham in 1959 and 1960. Designed in-house, it had a number of different features from the rest of the Cadillac lineup, but most predominantly, take a look at the rear and how toned down the fins are versus the other 1959 Cadillacs. And also note that the roofline, particularly at the back, is significantly different. So on its most expensive car, this Brougham was about $13,000 in 1959, or the equivalent of almost $150,000 in base price today. It was a very, very expensive car. Didn't sell very well. But on that most expensive car, Cadillac decided to really tone down its fins. And this would become the inspiration for the 1960 Cadillac, in part because the car, the 59 Eldorado Brougham, was actually designed in-house by Cadillac designers, but it was built in Italy by Pininfarina. Now, some of you may know that Cadillac went back to Pininfarina in the 1980s to have them build the Elante, at least the body for the Elante, and it was very similar for the 1959 Eldorado Brougham. In fact, perhaps it was because Cadillac had that pre-existing relationship with Pininfarina that the Elante and that Pininfarina badge really came into being, because by the time the Elante was coming around, it was Chuck Jordan who was leading some elements of General Motors design. He would ascend to the vice presidency in 1986 of GM design, but he was a designer on the 1959 and 1960 Cadillac. So I just wonder if that was where this relationship started. Chuck Jordan loved Ferraris and cars that were designed by Pininfarina. So not quite sure what's the chicken and the egg story there. But regardless, the Pininfarina partnership really dates back far beyond the Elante for Cadillac. In any case, that 1959 Eldorado Brougham really provided the inspiration for what you see here, the 1960 Cadillac. Now, the 1960 Cadillac was not only different from the 59 in the rear, but also in the front. Notice as an example, the turn signal and parking lamps on the 1959 Cadillac in the inset, and how much more round and bulbous they are and how much larger the bumper is than this 1960 Cadillac that is shown in the mainframe. And I think the 1960 really executes this much more elegantly. You also don't have that divider bar running kind of underneath the headlamps and in the midsection of the grille. It's moved up a little bit, and you have this wall-to-wall grille texture that really was a wall-to-wall texture on the 59, but you couldn't see it as well because of that divider bar. Here, it helps accentuate the width of what already is an extremely large vehicle. Now, you also have an extremely elongated and interesting aspect ratio associated with the Cadillac emblem there and the V. This is another touch that was executed on these cars to make them look wider. It almost looks like you put that emblem in a modern day computer and just kind of stretched it along the horizontal dimension. But it's effective. And by the way, it looks very similar to the emblem that would appear on vehicles like the 1958 Chevrolet that kind of shamelessly copied Cadillac in terms of a number of elements of design. Now, as we rotate along to the front three-quarter view, you can see a number of elements of beautiful design and sculpture that General Motors was known for during this time frame. Namely, look at how the belt line just continues and starts to form that fin as it goes rearward. You have this beautiful little filleted surface in between the fin and the main section of the quarter panel that you can see here is catching a highlight, and that highlight really helps distinguish the fin from the rest of the quarter panel. You also have this crease that starts from the area behind the headlights. It really is a continuation of the hood and this section of the fender that's just over top of the headlamps as it wraps around and it continues rearward on the fender and just beautifully fades out. Then, of course, you have the squircle-style wheel arches, and one of the things that I really enjoy about these Cadillacs is take a look at that A-pillar. Now, many cars during this time frame had wrap-around front glass, but this A-pillar and how it kind of curves around and then tapers as it goes to the bottom is just an absolutely artistic element of this car that, again, was emblematic of how talented General Motors design teams were during this time frame. And as we wrap around to the side, you can see a number of those features that I was mentioning before, but you also notice the roof and the backlight in this case, and that gorgeous angle with which it touches down on the rear section of the car just ahead of the deck lid. And of course, you notice the fins here that are, let's say, much more toned down, as I mentioned previously, from the 1959 Cadillac. I also love the way that the rocker panels just tuck in ever so gently and not too severely, but it gives the car a little bit of slimming, visual slimming, I should say, in this particular shot. Notice that the highlights are catching the upper portion of the car, and then that leaves the lower portion really in this shadow to disappear, and that helps give it a less portly look, particularly from this glance. And as we rotate around to this rear three-quarter view, notice how wonderfully pointed those fins are. I mean, they're shockingly pointed. You clearly could not do something like this today, because if you were backing up, it would risk impaling somebody. And the tail lamps are just beautifully integrated into the fin itself, versus in the 1959s, they had this kind of rocket form. You do have some auxiliary lamps that are included in the bumper vertically as well here, as well as the reverse lights. Interestingly, this would be the last year for this particular treatment of these lamps, as in 1961 they would rotate 90 degrees and be sideways, which would be something that ambulance makers would hate, because the 1961 Cadillacs, they had to chop off one of those lamps in order to help it accommodate the doors, because that just impinged on the width. So ambulance makers loved the 60 Cadillac, but they did not like the 1961. Now take a look at the deck lid and how it's got this beautiful kind of crease right at the edge of it that makes you think almost that that's the cut line, but the cut line is in fact lower and down toward the bumper. But I thought that was a great little visual trick that designers effected on this vehicle. Now, while the exterior was beautiful, the interiors on these Cadillacs were also a thing of beauty. Notice the gorgeous touches on the instrument panel, the various pieces of bright work, and the beautiful two-spoke steering wheel with the Cadillac emblem just inset there into the center section of the hub. This, like the 59 Oldsmobile as an example, and other steering wheels, was more of a safety-style steering wheel. Notice how that center hub is recessed. This was, of course, before the collapsible steering column had been introduced. And also check out that beautiful cloth pattern on the seats that I would say looks rich and was also quite durable for the time too. So it served two excellent purposes. And in this photo, we have a little bit higher option Cadillac Deville. Notice there's a cruise control actuation button in that top left pod. And one other thing I'll point out on these vehicles is that the air conditioning control, you can see there on the left-hand side, was totally separate from the heater control on the right-hand side. automakers had not yet integrated the air conditioning and HVAC, I would say air conditioning with the broader HVAC system, including the heater box. And so there were two separate controls. You'd effectively kind of turn the heater off, turn the air conditioning on, turn the air conditioning off, turn the heater on. That would go away in 1964 when Cadillac would introduce the industry's first automatic climate control. And that was a one-year Cadillac exclusive over at General Motors before the other divisions could pick it up in 1965. And then other makes would introduce automatic climate control thereafter, namely Lincoln in 1966. But here, everything was still separate. And here we have just one more shot of the front bench seat so that you can see the beautiful cloth pattern and these various buttons and stitchwork that Cadillac designers really just took this to another level in terms of the interior. Even a bench seat they made look beautiful. I also love the little lights in the doors. Now, before we go to the engine bay, you'll have to check out the trunk here and notice how deep the trunk is and how wide. Well, the depth here is because the fuel tank is ahead of the trunk. It's kind of behind the rear seat, something that Fords would do for many years, all the way up until the last Crown Victorias, Mercury Marquis, Lincoln Town Cars. But General Motors would abandon as the years would go by, namely when they redid the full-size cars, the 1965 model year. They would move the fuel tank underneath the trunk floor, and so you didn't have these deep well trunks. Some people loved it because you got more storage space. Some people didn't like it because you really had to stoop over to get your groceries and things because the trunk was so deep. So it was kind of a love it, hate it, I would say, relationship with the trunk floor. And that's why Ford, I think, kind of stuck with it. Its buyers liked that, as well as the sideways facing rear seats and wagons. That was another thing that Ford buyers liked, but not everybody enjoyed those traits. And under hood, we have the Cadillac 390 cubic inch V8. This would be the largest variant of the original Cadillac V8 that was introduced for the 1949 model year. It would continue on through the 1962 model year. In 1963, Cadillac would introduce a revised version of the 390 cubic inch V8. And this 390 was introduced in the 1959 model year. In 1958, it was 365 cubic inches. It was enlarged to 390 cubic inches in 1959. It was carried over in 1960 and made, I believe, about 345 gross horsepower. So a good smooth engine paired with the old school 4-speed hydromatic transmission that was well proven in World War II, used in everything from Army tanks to other military equipment. And that hydromatic transmission was extremely reliable and durable. And it backed this 1960 Cadillac quite well. You can also see from this underhood photo the big GM A6 air conditioning compressor that would freeze you out. Great air conditioning in General Motors cars. And also, interestingly, the blower motor is very easy to service on this vehicle, something that GM would, I guess, discard as they would go on to full-size production in later years, where they would tuck the blower motor inside the passenger side fender. I don't know why they did that. I guess it was because of space, but it certainly made it much harder to service than it is clearly on this car, where it's just out in the open and easy to access, like most other things. So what do you think of this 60 Cadillac? Do you like the 60 better, or the 59, the 59 DeVille, Eldorado, Biarritz, or the Eldorado Brougham, as I said before? Put a comment in the comments section and let me know. By the way, some people were asking if I had a Patreon page, and I don't really have that, but if you'd like to donate, feel free to hit the Super Thanks button on YouTube below. Thanks again for watching.